Throughout human history, mankind has waged war, sometimes for political, occasionally economic, and often for religious reasons. During these wars, we have created all manner of deadly, destructive, and occasionally incredibly bizarre weapons. In this video, we'll be looking at 5 of the strangest weapons that were invented during World War II. Number 5. Bat bombs. In 1941, a Pennsylvanian dentist by the name of Little S. Adams took a trip to Carlsbad Caverns National Park, which is located in the Guadalupe Mountains of southeastern New Mexico. Whilst inside, he was awestruck by the strength and vast number of bats found to dwell within these caves. Whilst driving home from his trip, he was shocked and dismayed to hear of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor over the car radio. Thinking back to his visit to the cave, watching the bats roost before dawn, knowing that most buildings in Tokyo were made from wood, a plan formed in his mind. In January of 1942, he wrote a letter to the White House with a suggestion of a new weapon: bat bombs. This plan involved dropping a container of some kind holding bats attached to a timed incendiary device. An aircraft would then drop them over Japan before dawn, and the bats would be released mid-flight. The bats carrying the bombs would roost in the roofs of the buildings. The timed devices would then ignite, setting fire to Japanese cities as the people slept. This plan was read and then bizarrely approved by President Roosevelt. Roosevelt stated, "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but it's worth looking into." After approval, the United States Air Force put a team together to make this idea a reality. They had to determine and agree on many different factors to put this plan into action. What type of bombs could they attach to the bats? How would they store and transport the bats? And most importantly, what species of bat would they use? After many tests, they settled on the Mexican free-tailed bat, mostly for their tendency towards roosting in vast numbers over small distances. Originally, they thought to use white phosphorus as the incendiary, as it ignites within 5 minutes of contact with air. However, when chemist Louis Pfizer joined the team, he suggested using his newest invention, napalm. It was found that a 14-gram bat could carry a 15 to 18-gram payload of napalm. The napalm was put into small capsules dubbed H2 units, which were then glued onto the bats. Glued, actually stuck onto their little bellies with adhesive. The bats were then loaded into metal tubes, each containing 1,040 bat bombs. These tubes were then dropped from aeroplanes, and parachutes would deploy and the sides would open, allowing the bats to fly all over the city and roost. Fairly soon after testing began in May of 1943, at Carlsbad Army Airfield, an accidental release of bats caused a fire. The little bats roosted on a fuel tanker and caused utter devastation. More tests were scheduled but ultimately scrapped after it was estimated that $2 million, which is worth approximately $34 million today, was spent on the project, which was moving very, very slowly, and was overtaken in the race to end the war by the Manhattan Project. Number 4. The German Space Mirror. It's generally well known that mirrors can reflect the sun's rays. It's also known that the sun's rays when reflected from a curved or concave mirror, reflect light into a singular focal point. These mirrors have many applications. They're used in telescopes and are used when making magnifying mirrors, such as the one you might shave or apply your makeup in. However, one German physicist, Hermann Oberth, had bigger plans for this type of mirror. And when I say bigger plans, I mean enormous. In 1929, plans were begun for the construction of a space station orbiting Earth. On this space station was to be built a 100-metre wide concave mirror. This would then be weaponised and used to point the power of the sun's reflected rays directly towards a particular point on the planet, like a kid with a magnifying glass burning ants. As World War II progressed, German scientists at the German Army Artillery Proving Ground at Hillersleben started to quite like the idea of a weapon that could harness the sun's energy and create a super weapon. Thus began the conception of the sun gun. This helio beam was set to be over 1 kilometre wide and would orbit Earth attached to a manned space station. It's reported that it would have been so powerful that it could boil oceans and lay waste to whole enemy cities. The Germans even set a budget aside to work on this colossal mirror. They worked out that it would take about 15 years to construct by sending materials up into space on rockets. Oberth called the sun gun the ultimate weapon. Thankfully, it was only ever theoretical. Number 3. Inflatable tanks. I'm sure over the many hundreds of wars waged across many hundreds of years, fashion designers haven't been at the forefront of weaponry invention. During World War II, a young army recruit by the name of Bill Blass joined the US Army's 603rd Camouflage Battalion. From an early age, Bill was interested in fashion design, stating in his later autobiography that his schoolbook margins were often filled with Hollywood-style fashion sketches instead of the notes that he should have been taking. As a side note, Bill Blass's company is still going today. The 603rd Camouflage Battalion was also known as the Ghost Army. They were a tactical unit given a unique mission to, at all costs, deceive and misinform Hitler's forces. They were to make them believe that Allied troop sizes and locations were different to what they were in reality. Many of the 1,100 men in the Ghost Army were artists, recruited straight out of art schools in New York and Philadelphia. One of their many means of deception was inflatable Sherman tanks. The inflatable decoys made the Germans think that Allied forces were better equipped than they actually were. The inflatable tanks were made of pressurised rubber tubes, covered in fabric and painted to look just like tanks. From a distance. 148 of these inflatable tanks were deployed in one operation in 1944. They were also used during Operation Fortitude to confound and confuse German intelligence. This was done in two ways. Firstly, it made the Allied troops seem significantly larger than they actually were, and it hid the location of the real tanks. Quote marks, making it appear that the invasion would be at Pas de Calais rather than at Normandy. Ultimately, by masking their real numbers and movements, along with double agents supplying false information, the Germans attacked the Ghost Army. Losing only 3 men, this brave troop saved the lives of an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 servicemen. Number 2. The Krumlauf. Wouldn't it be great if you could shoot at your enemy, knowing full well that they couldn't shoot you back? Well, in Germany in 1943, this very idea gave rise to the bizarre invention of the Krumlauf, a rifle with a curved barrel. There were a variety of versions made. There were 30, 45, 60 and 90-degree bends. That being said, none of them were, as you would imagine, very successful. They had incredibly short-lived usage, only being able to fire between 160 and 300 rounds, depending on the angle of the bend. And another, and probably the main reason that they weren't rolled out fully, is that the build-up of gases within the barrel would cause the bullet to completely shatter, effectively turning them from rifles into shotguns and making them only really particularly useful at close range. And number 1, Project Pigeon. Quite possibly out of all of these weird inventions, my absolute favourite, without question, is Project Pigeon, later named Project Orcon, short for Organic Control. Imagine, it's 1943. The American Navy is trying to come up with a way to ensure that missiles fired towards the incredibly formidable German Bismarck battleships would accurately hit their targets without the need for men to pilot aeroplanes dangerously close to them. How could they ensure that the missiles they fired would hit their intended targets? Before the advent of radar, this was a perplexing problem. Well, the renowned behaviourist, psychologist, inventor and author B.F. Skinner had an idea. Whilst watching a flock of birds, a plan started to formulate in his mind. Suddenly I saw them as devices with excellent vision and extraordinary manoeuvrability, he had stated. Could they not guide the missiles? After seeking government funding for his top-secret Project Pigeon, he was dismayed that nobody really took the idea all that seriously. Nevertheless, he persisted, and eventually the National Defence Research Committee granted him $25,000 to begin testing, which, adjusted for inflation, is $430,000. The project seemed simple enough. Train pigeons using operant conditioning, which is a form of behaviour training using positive or negative reinforcements, so that they would recognise the shape of the German battleships. These pigeons were put into separate pressure-sealed compartments in the nose cone of a missile. Lenses would then project images onto screens in front of the pigeons. The pigeons had been trained to peck on the screen when they saw the shape they recognised, in this case, Bismarck battleships. The hinge mechanism on the screens would then steer the missile towards the battleships, and a successful hit would be guaranteed. Incredibly, tests were really successful. The pigeons were hitting their targets. The missiles were flying on course. Despite the early successes of the project, the government wasn't very responsive to the idea of putting pigeons in missiles. Quite rightly so. And by December of 1944, the project had been scrapped. Further prosecution of this project would seriously delay others, the military said. The other project being worked on at the same time? Radar. Thank you so much for joining me on this slightly bizarre tour of incredibly odd weapons created during World War II. As always, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. See you next time.